What do you do when God appears silent? When evil seems to be triumphant? When God's plan just doesn't make sense anymore? Maybe life isn't just hard or confusing. Maybe it feels downright unfair. You pray, but nothing changes. You cry out, yet heaven seems shut tight. You try so hard to do everything right, and yet everything falls apart. What do you do then? Many people stop praying. Some choose to walk away entirely. Others put on a brave face, pretending they're okay while their faith quietly fades inside. But there was one man in the Bible who did something different. He didn't run away, didn't pretend, and he certainly didn't stay silent. He dared to question God. His name was Habachok. He isn't one of the famous prophets. He didn't part seas or call down fire. He never stood before kings or led massive revivals. No miracles, no dramatic battles, no fiery furnaces, no lions' dens. If you blink, you might almost miss him in the Bible. Yet, Habachuk did something almost no one else in Scripture ever dared to do. He looked God in the eye and asked, "Why? Why do you allow this? Why do you stay silent? Why do you let evil win? Why do you just watch and do nothing?" And here's what makes his story even more surprising. God didn't strike him down, didn't rebuke or punish him. Instead, God answered. Habakkuk is unique because his entire book isn't a message to the people. It's a conversation with God. It's not a sermon, a warning, or a prophecy to nations. It's the raw dialogue of a broken man speaking to a silent heaven. This makes his story dangerous and powerful, because Habakkuk says aloud what many believers only whisper in secret. He voices the questions we're afraid to ask, the doubts we hide behind worship songs and forced smiles. Yet he's not faithless. Habakkuk remains a faithful man, as faithful as anyone could be, who's simply hurting. There's a profound difference here. He doesn't stop believing in God. He just can't understand God anymore. And perhaps that's exactly where you might be right now. Maybe you still believe, but you don't understand why God allowed that painful loss. Why your prayers feel unanswered. Why the wicked seem to prosper while the good suffer. Why God seems so slow or distant. Habakkuk lived in such a world where justice was fading, violence was common, corruption was rewarded, and God seemed silent. Instead of walking away, pretending, or hiding his pain, Habakkuk did something incredibly bold and terrifying. He took his questions straight to God, not behind God's back, not bitter or defiant, but face to face. By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why Habakkuk's conversation with God might just be the most honest prayer in the entire Bible, because it's not the story of a man who lost his faith. It's the story of a man whose faith was tested, stretched, and refined by pain and confusion. Habakkuk found himself living amidst a generation that was far from holy, a broken era where morality seemed upside down. Right and wrong had swapped places. Truth was no longer steadfast but fluid. Power eclipsed righteousness, and survival took precedence over integrity. Even though Judah remained God's chosen people, with the temple standing tall, priests offering sacrifices, and worship songs filling the air, something was deeply wrong beneath the surface. Beyond the temple walls, the nation was decaying. Violence had become commonplace, corruption openly displayed, and injustice was the new norm. Courts that existed to defend the innocent had become tools wielded by the powerful to crush the poor. Ignore the weak, silence the righteous, and let the wicked flourish. Those who exploited others built grand houses, gained influence, and roamed freely with laughter and success, while those committed to doing what was right were marginalized, mocked, and forgotten. This was not merely a political downfall. It was a collapse of moral fabric. Habakkuk witnessed it all with a heavy heart. He wandered through streets where brutality was ordinary, saw men shamelessly taking advantage of their neighbors, and observed leaders who spoke of God publicly but robbed their people in secret. He noted religious rituals performed with spotless hands but corrupt hearts, hypocrisy cloaked in sacred vestments. What pained him most wasn't the existence of evil. That had always been a reality, but that evil seemed to be prevailing, with God remaining silent. No thunder rolled from the heavens, no judgment or correction came, no intervention was heard. Day after day, week after week, year after year, the cycles of crime, injustice, and oppression persisted, yet heaven remained quiet. Habachuk prayed fervently, but nothing shifted. He waited patiently, but nothing changed. Instead, things deteriorated further. Slowly, a troubling question began to grow in his soul, not questioning God's power or existence, but his justice. How could God watch this wickedness and do nothing? How could he hear the cries of the innocent and stay silent? How could he call these people his own and let them destroy each other? These questions were raised not out of rebellion, but from a believer's broken heart. It is one hardship to endure suffering, but another entirely to suffer and feel forgotten. It is one struggle to walk through darkness, but another to feel as if God has extinguished the light. Habakkuk's world was no fairy tale. It resembled a place very similar to ours. A world where evil often appears strong, justice seems weak, and choosing the right path demands greater sacrifice than the wrong one. And within this harsh reality, Habachuk was on the verge of speaking words to God that most dare not voice aloud. There is a particular moment that comes for everyone who carries a broken heart, that heavy silence that feels even more unbearable than pain itself. Habachuk had reached that very point. He had been a witness to suffering. He had waited patiently. He had prayed fervently. Yet nothing seemed to change. The streets remained steeped in violence. The courts were mired in corruption. The wicked continued to triumph while the righteous endured hardship, and through it all, heaven remained silent. Then one day, Habachuk could no longer keep his anguish locked inside. He didn't prepare a carefully crafted sermon. He didn't reach for beautiful, comforting words. He didn't put on a mask of strength. Instead, he opened his mouth and spoke directly to God. Not in poetry nor in worship, but with raw honesty. "How long, Lord," he asked, "must I cry out for help without an answer? How long must I call out against violence without salvation? Why do you allow me to witness such injustice? Why do you permit wrongdoing to continue? Destruction and violence surround me. There is strife and conflict everywhere. The law is ineffective. Justice fails to prevail. The wicked encircle the righteous, twisting what should be right into perversion." This was not a soft or polite prayer. It wasn't made for comfort. This was the desperate cry of a weary heart, a prayer born from frustration and fatigue. Habachuk wasn't merely talking about God from a distance. He was speaking to God intimately, and that distinction is critical. He didn't complain to people. He didn't protest to the leaders. He didn't surrender to despair himself. He went directly to God. He said what many believers fear to admit out loud. "I don't understand you. I don't understand your silence. I don't understand your patience. I don't understand your ways." Yet here lies something profoundly powerful. Habachuk did not abandon his faith. He didn't walk away from God or give up hope. Instead, he brought his faith into the midst of his struggle. He held onto it tightly, because only someone who truly believes would dare to argue with God. Only someone who trusts deeply expects a response. Only someone who still hopes can bravely ask why. Habachuk's prayer was not rebellion against God. It was a relationship with God. It was not disrespect but desperation. A genuine voice from a man who knew God well enough to speak honestly and trusted God enough to wait patiently for an answer. What Habachuk did not realize was that God was poised to answer, and that answer would challenge and overturn everything he thought he understood about justice, judgment, and divine ways. Having spoken his grief and laid bare his soul, Habachuk waited. He awaited correction. He sought comfort. He longed for God to finally declare, "I see your pain. I will set things right." And God did respond. but not in the way Habachok had expected. God said effectively, "Look among the nations. Watch and be utterly amazed. I am doing something in your time. Something so incredible. You would not believe it even if someone told you." Then God uttered words that would shake everything Habachok believed. "I am raising up the Babylonians, the Chaldeans," a name that struck terror across the ancient world. They are not righteous. They are not merciful. They were anything but gentle. This was a fierce, brutal, and violent pagan empire. They conquered not just out of necessity but for pleasure. They destroyed whole cities to boost their pride. They openly mocked the gods of the nations they overpowered. Their name was synonymous with cruelty, terror, and leaving cities in ruins and ashes. And yet, this brutal power was the very nation God had chosen to enact his justice. Habachok cried aloud for justice. God responded with the promise of invasion. Habachok begged God to halt the ongoing violence, but God declared he was sending an army. Habachok pleaded for God to address the evil within Judah, but God revealed he would bring something far more terrifying from outside their borders. Suddenly, the solution seemed worse than the problem itself, the cure more painful than the disease. God explained, "They are a ruthless and impetuous people. They sweep across the entire earth. They are feared and dreaded. They scoop up prisoners like grains of sand. They laugh at fortified cities. They laugh at fortified cities." This was not the kind of justice Habachok had imagined. This was not the kind of divine intervention he had prayed for. His desire was for God to correct his own people, but God was preparing to crush them instead. The most startling part was not that Babylon was coming. It was that God was sending them. God was not merely reacting or adjusting his plan in surprise. This was his plan all along. He intended to use a nation more wicked than Judah to judge Judah. It didn't make sense. It didn't feel right. It didn't sound like the God Habachok thought he knew. How could a holy God employ an unholy nation? How could a just God empower an unjust empire? How could God punish evil by wielding something even more evil? Habachok had asked for light, but God answered with thunder. He had requested healing, but God announced surgery. Painful, violent, terrifying surgery. In that moment, Habachok's heart sank. He realized he'd prayed for God to act, but he wasn't prepared for the manner in which God would act. And what followed would test Habachok's faith far deeper than before. God had spoken, yet instead of peace, Habachok felt conflict. Instead of relief, fear settled in. Instead of clarity, confusion clouded his mind more than ever. God's answer didn't solve the problem. It magnified it. Judah was sinful, yes. But Babylon? Babylon was far worse. Cruel, violent, godless. They crushed nations with no mercy, laughing as cities burned. And God had just said, "I am sending them." Habachok could not comprehend it. So he turned back to God once again, not in rebellion or anger, but in confused faith, and said essentially, "Lord, are you not eternal? My God, my Holy One, you never die. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Then how can you use people more wicked than we are? Why do you remain silent while the wicked swallow up those who are more righteous?" This was the most honest kind of prayer. The prayer that fears to speak, but speaks anyway. Habachok was not doubting God's existence. Rather, he wrestled with God's methods. Habachok still held firm in his belief that God is holy, eternal, and just. Yet, the plan unfolding before him didn't seem to align with God's character. Not from his vantage point. This sparked the deepest kind of spiritual struggle. When what God is doing appears at odds with who God truly is. When divine actions seem contradictory to God's nature. When silence from heaven feels like acquiescence. when the plan itself feels like a betrayal. Gazing upon Babylon's rise, Habakkuk thought, this isn't justice, this isn't righteousness, this isn't mercy. And yet somehow, this was woven into God's plan. In that moment, Habakkuk's battle transcended the fate of his nation. He wrestled with his very understanding of God. He confronted a terrifying and sacred revelation that God is always righteous, but not always predictable, always good, but not always comprehensible, always in control, yet not inclined to explain his decisions. Habakkuk had sought answers and ended up with even more questions. Rather than turning away, he chose a path revealing the depth of his faith. He decided to wait, to stand firm, to listen actively, to watch for what God would say next. This decision was transformative. Every genuine faith struggle eventually reaches a point where words fail. The arguments exhaust themselves, and questions can no longer bear the heart's weight. Habakkuk had arrived at this moment. He had voiced his doubts, questioned boldly, wrestled with God's silence, and now realized a profound truth. He could not compel God to justify his ways. So he did something both simple and profound. He declared, I will stand at my watch, station myself on the ramparts, and look to see what he will say to me. This marked a turning point. Habakkuk ceased his argumentation and began waiting. He relinquished his demands and embraced listening. He stopped trying to dominate the conversation and positioned himself to receive. Spiritually, this is one of the hardest stances a human heart can take. Waiting often feels like weakness. Silence can seem like defeat. Stillness can appear as surrender. Yet, Habakkuk grasped the wisdom only mature faith comprehends. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in charging forward but in standing still before God. He didn't walk away or shut down. He refused to harden his heart. Instead, he ascended spiritually to a watchtower, a place of perspective, patience, and humility. There, he waited, not with folded arms or bitterness, but with hopeful expectation. He believed God would speak, even though he didn't know when or how. Here is the truth that changes everything. Faith isn't always about speaking. Sometimes, faith means standing still and waiting for God to reveal his reasons. Sometimes it means saying, I don't understand you, but I trust you enough to wait. I don't like your answer, but I respect you enough to listen. I don't see the whole picture, but I believe you do. Though clarity had not yet come to Habakkuk, he chose posture over despair, trust over doubt, and hope over resignation. Habakkuk positioned himself, ready and receptive, in a place where he believed God could communicate with him. When someone truly sets themselves to hear from God, silence isn't permanent. What followed would not only provide answers to Habakkuk's pressing questions, but also reshape how faith is understood for generations to come. Habakkuk waited attentively. He was neither asleep nor distracted, purely waiting. Then God spoke, without anger or rebuke, but through profound revelation. God instructed him, write the vision, make it clear on tablets so that a herald may run with it. This message was meant for more than just Habakkuk. It was intended for all future generations. God then declared something seemingly simple, yet destined to resonate through history. For the righteous shall live by faith. These words didn't promise that everything would suddenly make sense or be easy. Instead, they held a deeper meaning, an invitation to trust God even in moments of confusion and uncertainty. God continued to explain that evil wouldn't triumph forever. The proud wouldn't reign indefinitely. Violent empires, including Babylon, were destined to fall. Every arrogant power, every unjust system, would ultimately collapse, not immediately, not swiftly, but certainly. God wasn't ignoring evil, nor was he late. Rather, he was operating on a timetable far beyond human patience. Then the contrast became clear. The proud put their trust in themselves. They rush ahead with confidence, building empires on violence. But the righteous live by faith. They rely not on what they see, control, or comprehend, but on trust. Habakkuk was learning more than just an explanation. He was learning a way to live. The significance of this moment only grows when we realize these words didn't end with Habakkuk's era. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul would read and reflect on these words, shaping his letters to the Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews, and thereby influencing the entire foundation of salvation theology. One perplexed prophet, standing watch, recorded words that transformed the world's theology, because this was never solely about Babylon or Judah. It was about how humans are meant to walk with God in a fractured world, not by having all answers, but by trusting the one who does. Habakkuk wasn't given a detailed timeline or exhaustive explanations. Instead, he was given something far greater, a foundation built on trusting God rather than understanding Him. From that moment forward, his life's foundation shifted from comprehension to faith, and that change was revolutionary. But God's message was far from over. What came next was difficult to hear. Yes, judgment was coming. Yes, evil would face justice. Yes, Babylon would fall, but not yet. God told Habakkuk, the vision is for an appointed time. Though it lingers, wait for it. It will surely come and will not delay. In other words, the promised outcome will happen, but not on humankind's timetable. And here lies the most painful part of faith, not when God says no, but when God says wait. Because waiting can feel like silence, and silence can be the hardest part of trusting. Habakkuk's experience feels like abandonment. It feels as though God has forgotten His people. But in reality, God had not forgotten. He was not slow, distracted, or confused. Instead, God was operating on a timeline far longer than one lifetime. Here is the difficult truth we often struggle to accept. God is never late, but He is rarely early. Habakkuk wanted rescue immediately. Judah desperately needed deliverance right then. The righteous were enduring suffering. The wicked were prevailing, and it was all happening now. Yet God's message was, trust me anyway. This is where faith stops feeling like a comforting song and becomes a heavy burden. Waiting hurts. Seeing injustice continue is painful. Praying and witnessing no change stings deeply. Silence wounds the spirit. Delays test our faith more brutally than outright denial ever could. And yet, God spoke a quietly powerful message. If it seems slow, wait. Not to figure everything out yourself, not to try fixing it alone, and certainly not to give up. Simply wait. Because what God has promised can never fail. It might be late by human standards, but it arrives perfectly on divine timing. Habakkuk did not receive speed or swift answers. Instead, he was given certainty. Sometimes, certainty is the only thing strong enough to hold together a heart weary from waiting. This chapter of Habakkuk's life wasn't about answers. It was about endurance, about trusting God even while history appeared broken and hopeless. This is where faith becomes real. Not when miracles are on display, but when hope is chosen deliberately in the darkest times. Something profound changed within Habakkuk. The questions didn't vanish. The dangers were still looming. The world was still fractured. But the man himself was no longer the same. He had stopped arguing with God. He had ceased demanding explanations. He relinquished control over what only God could govern. Instead, he began to worship, not because circumstances had improved, not because Babylon had vanished, nor because Judah was safe, but because he had truly seen God. At last, Habakkuk picked up his pen one final time and wrote not a complaint, but a song. He declared, though the fig tree does not blossom, and there is no fruit on the vine, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls. In other words, all the things a person depends on, food, income, stability, future, visible hope, were gone. Yet, in the face of this stark reality, he wrote the most startling words in the entire book. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. His joy did not come because God had provided explanations, or because the pain had ended. His joy came simply because God was still God. This is not the faith that sings praise after the miracle happens. No, this is the faith that chooses to praise before rescue arrives. This is not naive optimism, nor is it denial. This is surrender. Habachok didn't receive all the answers he wanted, but he gained God himself, and that was enough. The storm was still approaching, but peace had already settled within him. The world was still shaking, yet his heart was steady and unshaken. This is what genuine faith looks like. Not trusting God only to change your circumstances, but trusting God even if He doesn't. And this marks the most beautiful transformation in the entire story. Habachok approached God full of questions, but he ultimately left God filled with worship. Only after all the questions, only after the silence, only after the long period of waiting does the true meaning of Habachuk's story finally come into clear focus. This book was never really just about Babylon. It was never simply about Judah. It was never solely about judgment. At its core, it is about the human heart standing face to face with a mysterious God. Habachuk is not simply a prophet. He represents every believer who has ever felt baffled or perplexed. He embodies every person who has ever prayed deeply, yet heard no response. Every soul that has ever said, God, I trust you, but I do not understand you. He symbolizes the faithful, those who continued believing even when their faith was tested and hurt. And here lies the profound secret, hidden right before our eyes. This book is not primarily about God explaining himself to mankind. Rather, it is about God teaching humanity how to trust him, even without full explanations. God did not reveal everything to Habachuk. He never disclosed the entire plan. He did not clarify every detail. Yet, he provided just enough. Enough to inspire trust, enough to encourage waiting, enough to lead to worship. And this is precisely the kind of faith that heaven desires. Because genuine faith is not about trusting God when everything in life makes perfect sense. True faith is trusting God when life seems utterly senseless. If God only deserved our trust when we fully understood him, then he would not be God. He would be something manageable, something predictable, something small. But the true God is far greater than our questions, far greater than our timelines, far beyond our understanding. And yet, he still extends an invitation to come close. Habachuk did not lose his faith by questioning God. Instead, his questions refined and deepened it. He entered God's presence full of confusion and emerged anchored and secure. This is the hidden purpose of the book, not to eliminate mystery, but to teach us how to live within it, not to grant us control, but to instruct us how to trust. Maybe that is why Habachuk to confront God with his questions, so that generations afterward would learn to keep believing despite uncertainty. Now the story moves beyond Habachuk. It becomes your story. Perhaps your prayers seem unanswered. Perhaps you've done all you know to do, yet nothing has changed. Maybe evil appears to be prevailing. Perhaps those who are wrong seem to prosper. Maybe God feels silent, distant, unreachable. Yet Habachuk leaves us with a quiet but powerful truth. Silence does not mean absence. Delay is not denial. Confusion is not the end of faith. God is still at work. Even when you cannot perceive it, God continues to write the story. Even when the page appears blank, God remains faithful. Even when life looks unfaithful. Habachuk began this journey with pressing questions, but he ended with worship, not because he had answers to all questions, but because he trusted the one who does. And perhaps that is where your story is right now. Not at the place of answers, but at the vital choice to trust. So if you are waiting, keep waiting. If you are hurting, keep believing. If you are confused, keep moving forward, For the same God who carried Habachok is still carrying you. And perhaps someday you will look back and realize God was never silent. He was just working quietly all along. If this story has touched your heart, write in the comments what you are trusting God for. Subscribe before you forget, so you don't miss the next hidden story. And share this message with someone who needs it. Remember, someone else may be waiting on God right now, perhaps because they need His guidance or help even more than you do.